So I'm going to say a little bit about reflections on our program of journal flipping since 2015. I thought I'll summarize a few. I've picked out a few kind of journals as sort of case studies, if you like, given the time constraints, and I'll talk through a few of the kind of different I don't know, opportunities, challenges, issues that we've encountered along the way. If we have time at the end, well, hopefully we do, because I don't have a huge amount to say. It would be really interesting if you've got questions or feedback, or to hear your thoughts as well on your own experience of running your journals. So we launched in 2015 with just 7 journals. As I mentioned before, we launched using a third-party publishing provider. And within 3 years, we were then starting work building Janeway. As of spring 2024, so in the next 4 months, we will have 31 journals. So we've grown from 7 to 31, and that is under the OLH branded kind of published journals. Obviously, as we've heard, there's more than 200 journals being hosted on Janeway. There's many more out in the wild that we're still accounting for, like wildebeest kind of out there somewhere. Every so often another one pops up and we're made aware of. But the core kind of OLH publishing, which is supported by our university library partners, will stand at 31. So some case studies then. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through these from before. I'll start off with the Comics Grid. Shout out to editor-in-chief and founder Ernesto Priego, if he is online somewhere. I know he's going to be presenting either in person or remotely at some point over the next 2 days. So the Comics Grid, sorry, I've got I've got animation sequences. There we go. I've called this one the Radical Pioneer Journal. So they were advocating open access before it was officially mandated by governments and institutions in the UK. I think they date back to the early 2010s, about 2010, 2011, I think maybe they launched. They weren't adopted as a bunch of academics working in a kind of multidisciplinary field of comic scholarship. They weren't forced to adopt open access because of policy mandates. They embraced it as a precondition and they advocated it from the start. So from its inception, it was a born open access journal. As Ernesto said in an interview for our OLH Open Insights blog series in 2018, this was a digital humanities project because it was about becoming aware of how technologies of production not only influence but determine and are essential to all of our cultural phenomena. And he noted at the time that although there were other open access journals out there, they didn't have the full professional support and infrastructure. So at the time, not all of them had DOIs, not all of them were doing HTML and XML versions. Sometimes it was just a PDF version. They didn't all have ORCID, they didn't all have clear open licensing. So Comics Grid started, interestingly, they started on WordPress, so which is how I started my first journal, just not really knowing any better. So they just used, whatever was available. They then moved to Ubiquity Press. So I think you guys were supporting them at Ubiquity. You set them up at Ubiquity, right? And then after a couple of years at Ubiquity, they then joined on board. I think in 2016, they came and joined the OLH, which obviously meant that they didn't need to charge any article processing charges to their authors. It meant that they were sustainable and they were going to, survive the longer term. I thought they were a really interesting one to start with, mainly because of that kind of common story you hear again and again of people setting up journals just on a website, on WordPress, on Squarespace, on whatever other kind of platform that they find. But, there are kind of well-cited examples of academic and other kind of literary type publications actually disappearing and things just going missing. I remember there was a really interesting case of a literature journal where the software provider had been bought out, and the whole community spent about 6 weeks trying to find who actually owned the domain name. And eventually it was found, and it was backed up on something like the UK Web Archive. But it really highlights the importance, as we all know, of having proper archiving and indexing and so on. So they were one of our first adopters. Another case study that you probably know something about is Glossa, which I'm calling the Big Fish Journal. So Glossa was founded on the back of a very well-known journal called Lingua, which was the field-defining journal of general linguistics in Europe. It was established in 1949. It was the go-to prestigious journal. It was published by Elsevier. And in 2016, the entire editorial board quit over high subscription costs. I remember being in the European Commission at that time during the Dutch presidency, and I remember some of those meetings where publishing reps and editors and European Union officials were kind of having huddled discussions, and there was a lot of anger and volatility, and it was a big risk for Glossa to be able to launch a new journal. It was made possible for various reasons, and we may hear a little bit more later on today from the editor-in-chief, Johan Roerijk. I suspect most of it was to do with Johan's kind of charisma and commitment and passion and sense of fairness and equitable publishing that persuaded the editorial board to move. But it was also made possible by the fact that they did have sufficient funding to be able to take a risk. And it was good timing. I mean, we were just setting up as a new publisher run by two early career academics. So it was a partnership that worked really well. Johan is now extremely well known. He's the executive director of Plan S. He's done various interviews online and elsewhere about the process of migrating over. And I thought this quotation was a really interesting one that I'll just share with you. He said, "We proved that the entire journal community of readers, reviewers, authors, and editors can be easily and quickly moved to a different title and publisher. You could compare it to buying a new car for the family. The old Elsevier title, Lingua, still exists, but it has become a very different journal content-wise and quality-wise. By contrast, Glossa is simply the contribution of pre-2016 Lingua." So, I mean, one of the things that he went on to talk about actually that I think is worth thinking about is the problems and the kind of the time lags and delays of quality indicators like journal impact factor. So after 5 years, Clarivate still hadn't provided an impact factor for Glossa. They now have, and it's starting to get picked up, and the stats are improving. It takes that long, and by contrast, there was a 5-year delay of old Lingua benefiting in terms of impact numbers from prior to 2016 when it had moved. So it's something perhaps as a community working in kind of radical OA that we need to think about when we are migrating our journals over. So the Big Fish Journal, there are pros and cons. I mean, we obviously want big fish migrations. We want to be taking journals from commercial publishers where editorial boards are unhappy. We want to publicize the fact that what remains is a zombie journal, that the entire scholarly community has chosen to exit that publication, to withdraw their labor, to make it very clear to the community that we no longer invest our trust and our time and our work with this publication. And anybody, frankly, who goes to work for this publication, is doing so, is taking a risk that in the knowledge of what's been happening. However, for a small publisher like OLH with a finite amount of funding, that yes, it's sustainable, yes, it is growing, but it's growing because we're conservative about how many journals we're able to take on board. So really large, big flips are not always possible, and you're never quite sure when they're going to happen. And that's been something that is quite tricky, is managing that juggle between being responsive, being rapid, being available when you start to hear on the grapevine that a big flip may be happening, or that a journal editorial board is not happy, that they are shopping around for another publisher, they want to go diamond open access. and you've got to try and fit that responsivity and rapid budgeting into what you've already prepared. You're planning the number of journal titles you've already got in the application process, you know, how many you think you're able to take on, and then you've got to start negotiating with how many articles each journal is going to be able to publish. Glossa, I forget off the top of my head actually how many they publish each year. I mean, it's hundreds. They are by far our largest journal. In some ways, they are our flagship journal because of their sheer volume and size and the speed with which they turn out peer review and the quality that they give to that journal. It's absolutely brilliant. They're much larger, in fact, than our OLH in-house journal, which sort of we do, you know, brilliant small curated collections a little bit more slowly. So Big Fish is an interesting case study to think about. Okay, another example, in fact, this might be a bit of an announcement. I don't know if we've publicly said this yet, but one of the journals that is currently migrating, which is going to be with us from spring 2014, is a journal called In Transition. I love this journal. This is a flagship journal in media studies and film studies. It was set up by the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, SCMS, over in North America. It was the video essay journal alongside their official journal of cinema and media studies. And it was launched as a collaboration between Media Commons, run out of Penn State University, and SCMS. I'm calling this one the Precarious Journal. So here is an example of a brilliant journal. It's got a fabulous reputation. It's run by some of the best practitioners and academics in the field. It's doing cutting edge work. It's doing videographic scholarship, which is obviously relevant and necessary to people working on AV content. And it is funded by a series of grants that perhaps have run out, and there isn't the proper digital and publishing infrastructure to keep supporting it. So they were left in a quandary. They had a website that they weren't able to update. There wasn't any kind of proper support for them to be able to make changes. And that was when they got in touch with me, and that was when we did an application through OLH. So there are these journals out there, you know, they've done all the hard legwork, they've built up the prestige, they've built up the reputation, they got the funding, they were going for a number of years, and then the funding runs out. What do we do then? And I think this is a repeated problem in academic circles. I mean, it does seem to be a problem, particularly with open access, where you have large grants that are on a 5-year or 3-year period. So it's an example of precarious open access publishing infrastructure. It depends how you define the term flip and flipping, which is an interesting conversation to have. They are not technically a flip in the sense that they are already open access. So we are not flipping something that was subscription access to open access. However, they very much, as far as I'm concerned, and I think we are concerned with our internal conversations, they very much sit within the OLH's core mission, which is to extend and support open access, particularly when it is vulnerable, and particularly when it is a journal that is so embedded in its scholarly community by some of the best practitioners in those fields, and it is in danger of disappearing or kind of just running out of steam or basically ceasing publication. That migration is a fun one for Mauro to be dealing with, given that it's quite hard for you to get access to all of the files that you need. It has to be done by hand. They're not really available in the formats that you would like.
It doesn't have a platform, a website, not formatted with data and but we got it in the end. So.
But that has to be then, we then have to juggle that into all of our workloads. You know, we're kind of managing multiple migration schedules for multiple new journals that are coming on board over the next 6 to 12 months. And when you come across one of them where nothing is available, you ask for a spreadsheet of content, and they come back and say, well, it's all in my inbox or it's all on my personal hard drive. That is what we're dealing with. That is the reality. And then we have to try and fit that into what we're doing. And Mauro, bless him, has to just cope. So there you go, example of a precarious journal migration. Okay, here's another interesting one. Oops, some similarities, I think, with Zygon, Arthur, who's a journal that's also in the process of setting up with us. This is what I call the long-running journal. So here's an example of something that has been going for decades. In this case, it's Ethnologia Europaea, which was first published in 1967. It's the international flagship journal within European ethnology, publishing scholarship of interest to ethnologists, cultural anthropologists, scholars of folklore, cultural historians, and cultural studies. So fantastic reputation, been going a very long time. I find these ones really interesting, and they do make my heart sing because they tend to own their own IP. That makes everything easier for us. Because they're such a long-running, well-established scholarly association, whenever they set up, they maintained some sort of governance structure, usually owned by the scholarly association. And as is the case here, and possibly with Zygon and others, they may have been through multiple publishers by the time they reach us over the decades. Sometimes there's been a period where everything was digitized, perhaps in the early 2000s or the 1990s. Sometimes there's a period where everything was then given DOIs, and you've got all of the back content, even if it's only available in PDF format. But nevertheless, migrating more than 60 years of journal archives requires a significant amount of customized coding, a lot of admin, and a lot of liaison with other publishers. And this is where it gets really interesting, and we start taking to Twitter with sarcastic jibes. But you're dealing with commercial publishers who are not always particularly happy that you're basically taking on their journals, that the editorial board have decided that they're leaving, thank you very much. They're not going to re-sign for the next 5 years. So you're then having to go to the press representatives and ask them very nicely for the XML or what any of the kind of content that you need. And what they tend to do is give it to you in a proprietary format. It might be worth saying something at this point about some of your recent experiences.
Basically to say that try not to tie your. Remember to use the microphone. Oh yeah.
Sorry, people online. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, people online. We'll just get Mauro mic'd. I keep passing over to him because he's standing next to me.
Yeah, just to say that it's a bit tricky when someone ties themselves to a very proprietary format, because when you want to migrate anywhere else, you're just putting yourself in out of trouble, right? So this is a good example because they're using a proprietary format there, but at least it's documented. We had cases where a publisher was using a proprietary format, XML format, not documented, without any specs or anything. You just have some XML, and you have to do trial and error until you figure out exactly what each of the tags means. So
that would be fun because it's different for each journal.
Exactly, yeah, it was also different between journals, so it was even worse. Yeah, they have lots of customizations over the years done. So yeah, this is just to say that please try to use JATS or whatever specification that is openly available, and we can read documentation about, because at some point you're going to need it. So it's
But also the tools that you've had to develop to scrape and collect all of this information, you've then put under open license.
Yeah, that's the good
side. So then
if
other journals in other scholarly communities wish to migrate again away from certain big 5 publishers who will remain nameless, that makes the work that we have done benefits everybody. That is available for other people to use in the future.
Yeah, we try to make them transparent and not tied to Genway specifically. So for example, for this specific case, we are transforming all of that proprietary XML into JATS directly, so that they could then reuse that JATS in any other platform. They don't have to stick with Genway. So at least we're doing some good to society there.
It'll become very obvious very quickly who it is. So it's Wiley ML for anyone who knows. Yeah, they have their own. Yeah.
It's totally fine. That's what we're here for, isn't it? Okay, so just to finish up then, last couple of minutes, I thought I would list issues and challenges. From my perspective, overseeing the journal applications process, as well as from the tech team's perspective, then having to implement those decisions and do the migrations themselves. I find reaching decision makers is actually quite tough. I am an academic. I work in academic circles. I'm not cold calling people as a publisher. I am going through a network of contacts. I use introductions wherever possible. Wherever possible. Even so, I get a meeting with a bunch of editors. Usually it goes very well. They're very excited. They'd love to join us. Thank you very much. Just going to have to report back to our steering committee, our editorial advisory board. We're owned by this scholarly society. And by the way, it's connected to a national heritage site. And so there's trustees there as well. And suddenly I'm not just in a room with 3 people that I know I have convinced through just the power of OLH, being more ethical and better than everybody else. I have to try and reach 15 other people, and I'm not given access to those people. I'm not in a room with those people. So I'd be really interested if anybody else has similar experiences, perhaps as a publisher or, trying to acquire or set up journals. How do we kind of reach these people? I mean, wherever possible, I try and invite myself to AGMs, to meetings. That doesn't always go down so well. Sometimes they let me, sometimes they don't. Journal ownership, I've touched on. Many journals don't own their IP. We recently had to redo our onboarding documentation on the editorial policy side and on the kind of tech side. And we included, clear templates of journal kind of governance, because so many academics that we deal with, and you say to them, that's great, who owns the journal? Maybe they were a born open access journal, and they're like, whoa, it's sort of online, isn't it? Like, do you own it? It's like, well, no, we're actually against proprietary journals. Like, we don't own it, and if you own it. So then we have to try and get them to think about, well, how do we protect that? Because we need to protect this for the future. So you need some sort of governing body to oversee a structure. You may even need legal support. In the case of Glossa, they set themselves up as an organization under charitable Dutch law, just to make sure that that process wasn't then kind of railroaded in any unforeseen way, because these are precarious processes. We rely on voluntary labor from editors and scholars over decades of time. Where you have charismatic individual editors who keep something going for 10 years, brilliant. But at some point, those people may retire or they may move on. And so it's incredibly important to think about this. Many times we have to set up a new title. We're doing this with a couple of journals at the moment. They don't own the IP. They've left the zombie journal. We're going to set up the new journal with the old editorial structure, but we have to give it a new name and we have to kind of relaunch it. So it is a flip, but at the same time, you could argue that's a new journal because it's a new title. So that's kind of an interesting quandary. We've heard a little bit then about migrating the back content. Quite often these archives are only available in proprietary formats. So we've heard a little bit from Maro about how hard, and Andy about how hard that is to access. Another one that I thought I'd draw your attention to is in the case of the long-running journal, where you've got archives going back to the 1960s, the majority of those print-only, original hard copies are a PDF. It's basically just a scan at some point was digitized. They're not in HTML and they're not in XML. Wouldn't it be brilliant if we could do that? We don't have the budget at OLH. So then we start talking with editors about whether there are particular grants they could apply for, whether they can get editorial assistance, postdoc positions, because it would be so great to then be able to properly make them interoperable, searchable, indexable, all the way back, to the 50s or 60s, whenever they first started publishing. The final one, this is really just my bugbear that I was going to share with you. Managing academic expectations. I feel qualified to say this as an academic. I'm not entirely happy with my community that years of commercial provision means that editors expect a particular standard of service. And yes, I think our customer service is outstanding. I think it is bespoke. I think we're a small, friendly team. We will go out of our way to try and help and support editors and journals with the onboarding process. But there are certain things we will not pay for. We are not going to remunerate editors. This is what they expect. With certain larger commercial providers, they get paid a salary to be an editor, and that's something that we can't provide. Our marketing and sales budget is very stretched. We are not going to be at all of the major conferences, at all of the humanities discipline with a big stand and a big table. We don't have print journals because we primarily publish digital. So we're not offering the same thing. It's not a fair competition. And when I'm meeting with editorial boards and they're shopping around for a new publisher, we are having to compete with those commercial providers. That's hard, you know. I know we have the moral high ground, but that's not enough. And even if some of the editors want to take that step and occupy that moral high ground, possibly their steering committee doesn't. You know, there's always somebody more conservative somewhere in the background who's sort of saying, actually, I'd rather just stick with, you know, this university press because I trust them, I know what they do. So these are challenges, and if anybody has any thoughts about them, I would love to pick your brains, possibly in the break. We probably got 1 or 2 minutes before 12 o'clock, so if there are any questions, more than happy to take them, if there's any online, and if not, yeah. Okay.
Let's pass the mic around.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. There's a tiny microphone coming to you.
I have a tiny question. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. And I particularly was interested in the precarious example. And I wonder if there's some scope for us to work together. I don't know if you know, but we're the publisher of formerly Cinema Journal of Cinema and Media Studies now. We took it over from University of Texas.
No, but yeah.
And we're in the midst of trying to flip it.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, I think we should chat.
Yeah, let's
definitely. Chat. I didn't know that you guys were taking that on.
Well, I think this might be the first time we've actually publicly said it.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, if there's anything we can do on the Fulcrum platform for media support, I mean, we have dedicated staff and funding that is for the main journal. We might be able to work something out.
Interesting. Oh, I wish you'd known that like 3 months ago.
Yeah, sorry, Mara.
Mara's done most of the legwork already. Thank you. Yeah, let's chat. If there aren't any other questions, any online? Brilliant, job done. I think we have a break now, Catherine, until lunch. Yeah, thanks very much.